Okay, lots of yapping to be done. Today covering all the Ashes of War, 116 of them. Now, not to be confused with the unique skills. These are the regular skills, that of which can be infused onto other weapons and that are in the form of an Ash of War. Now, as always, the criteria for this is based on how well it performs and how useful it is in PvE. So for instance, a skill might be really good, but if it's outclassed by something else, it's probably going to get lower on the list. And also, don't focus too hard on the placement of some of these skills, and probably draw your attention as to what I'm actually saying about them and what tier I put them in. Because I guarantee if I do this exact same video next week, the list might look a little bit different, but one thing that's probably going to be the same is my opinions. But anyway, it's going to be a longer video, so let's get into it. Now, starting off in the D tier, right at the bottom, we have Sky Shot. Now, the D tier is going to consist of the worst of the worst, like basically things that are just useless, and even if it does have a very specific use, it's probably just inevitably outclassed by something else anyway. And as for Sky Shot, this is a bow-based skill that shoots a singular arrow up in the sky, takes forever to land, gets zero tracking, obviously does pretty poor damage because it is an arrow, and even if enemies are the slightest bit mobile, it is just going to miss. If you're indoors, it's going to hit the ceiling. Like, the only use that I could possibly think of this thing is that it can hit enemies around a wall. But the thing is, you can't even lock onto enemies that are around a wall. And also, if you actually use the Rain of Arrows skill without FP, it basically does the exact same thing as this dumbass skill. Storm Wall, which is a parrying based skill that actually can deflect projectiles. Now, it is only for physical based projectiles like arrows and fire bombs, which is basically just useless because those are just very slow moving projectiles that don't even do much damage anyway, like just dodge or just walk a little bit. And as this thing pertains to a parrying based skill, it gives you just as many parry frames as like a medium shield parry, which is basically just useless. 114 Enchanted Shot, which is another bow-based skill. This one actually giving tracking to one of your arrows, which actually is kind of borderline useless because the damage is still going to suck, and the only purpose is to try and kite enemies out one at a time, which you can already do that with like the regular bow moveset. If you could infuse this onto like a great bow, I might find some more value in it because they actually perform better as a sniping-based option. Number 113, Thops's Barrier, which is another parry-based skill. This one not really giving you any more parry frames than anything else, but it only gives you the ability to be able to parry magic-based projectile attacks, which Counter Retaliation is just going to outclass this, because Counter Retaliation doesn't consume any FP also. When you're getting a regular parry, it's going to give you more parry frames, and if you do parry a magic-based projectile, it's going to actually turn it into your own magic projectile and turn it back at them. 112 Blink Bolt, which is one of the ones from the DLC, and honestly, I don't even know why this one even exists. It's like an iframe dodge with like a really long starting up frame and really long recovery frame, so it's just going to be outclassed by something like Bloodhound Step, because that one even consumes less FP, it's much faster, and you can actually dodge in every single direction, because Blink Bolt you can only really dodge forwards, and I don't really know why they didn't really get like a follow-up attack with this Ash of War, because the Death Knight weapons get a version of Blink Bolt, but they actually get follow-up attacks, so I don't know why we couldn't pair this alongside like an axe or a hammer and get its own unique version of a follow-up attack. That would have been pretty cool, but yeah, it feels like it's pretty just lazily designed and just thrown in the game. Number 111, Piercing Throw, which is one of the skills that can be infused onto the Smith Script Dagger, and this one is just meant as like a sniping-based option, so to speak, for this weapon, because it can go a little bit further than like the regular moveset that the Smith Script Dagger gets, but the thing is, it's still like just one regular throwing blade, which is not going to do much damage. It can go through enemies and potentially collapse, but it's such a small hitbox that that's rarely going to ever happen. Like, you're better off just taking a couple more steps forward and just using the actual moveset, which is going to be infinitely better. So there's a lot of other skills that can help complement the Smith Script Daggers much more than this one can. 110 Kick. Now, I wouldn't put this Ash of War onto any weapon because you can just remove your weapons and just have the default ability to kick in itself. Now, in the other games, kick was pretty useful because it was part of your base kit and you could just kick with basically every single weapon and just probably break shields. It just kind of just staggers enemies slightly sometimes, which like every single weapon can do anyway. 109 Ghost Flame Call, which is one of the ones from the DLC. The design of this is identical to the Death's Poker skill in Ghost Flame Ignition. Now, the difference being is that one is actually good, and this one fucking sucks. The damage is god tier awful. The frost buildup is basically non-existent. Like, I didn't even know what they were thinking with this thing. I don't know why it hasn't even gotten buffed a single time. But if you like the idea of the skill, just go pair it alongside the Death's Poker, because that one actually do really good damage, and this thing just sucks. Use any other frost skill instead, please. 108 Shield Bash, which this is a very small short range attack that the shields get that can stagger enemies like knights and omens if you really wanted to use it that way. So if you had like smaller types of weapons that otherwise couldn't really have that ability to do it, you could just use the shield to do so, which is a very niche use. And also I think things like Shield Crash could just do this exact same thing but just way better. 107 Storm Stomp. Now this skill is primarily meant for PvP, as it can like stun lock enemies and actually have guaranteed follow-up attacks, which in PvE is basically useless because there's no need to actually stagger enemies long enough to get like a light attack or a heavy attack off, because you can just do that already, as enemies aren't really going to be able to dodge around all the time, and this thing doesn't really stagger that many enemies in PvE either, so you're better off just using like any other damaging type of skill. It's actually going to do respectable damage, more stance damage, and it's better going to complement your weapon. 106 Wall of Sparks, which is off the perfume bottles. This one resulting in like this 360-degree AoE attack that can go pretty far, do some okay amounts of damage. Now the reason why I don't value it at all is because the heavy attack already does this for you, but it's actually just better as well because it can stun lock better, it does more stance damage, it comes out a bit faster, and it's obviously not going to consume any FP. Like Wall of Sparks can go a little bit further and maybe do a little bit more damage depending on your talismans, but it's just not really worth using at all. 105 Parry, which is just the regular parry skill, which a lot of shields already come with this passively, and parrying in this game is very niche. 90% of the enemies can't be parried, and the very small select that can be parried sometimes require multiple successful attempts just to be able to get the riposte, and even if you did want to parry, things like counter retaliation are going to be much better, as it does give you more parry frames, because regular parry, especially with medium shields, are not that good at all. Now this could be a good early game option until you get to counter retaliation, but I think the buckler just outclasses this anyway. 104 Prelate's Charge, which is one of the worst damaging skills in the entire game. The only benefit that it does serve is being able to stun lock smaller types of enemies, because against larger ones it just sucks, but you could pair this alongside the Great Stars and get a whole bunch of bleed build up and some nice health regen. But the thing is, there are so many other skills in this game that could also just hit multiple times quickly and just give you a bunch of bleed build up and a bunch of health regen while retaining some respectable damage. Stuff like Stormcaller or Wild Strikes are just going to be much better options in my opinion. Now it's probably not going to heal you as fast as Prelate's Charge would, so you actually could power stance Great Stars and have your offhand one just have Prelate's Charge, and when you're going through a legacy dungeon, you could just use it against a trash mob to just get a whole bunch of health back really quick. But the thing is, Prayerful Strike just does this way better, because every single hit with Prayerful Strike gives you 30% of your health back. Now getting into this C tier, this is going to consist of skills that are like borderline trash or like actually somewhat average, but they're just very niche. And at 103, we have no skill, which kind of falls under that category. The only use that this skill has is to slap it onto a shield, so you can actually like block and use the skill of your main weapon at the same time, because sometimes you don't want to actually default to using your shield-based skill. But yeah, that's the only use that it has. 102 Golden Slam. Now this is a short range AoE attack. You actually get some really good hype armor, nice stance damage. The total overall damage is not that bad. You can put it on almost every single weapon in the game. Now the thing is, I just consider it to be outclassed by Ground Slam, because that's the exact same thing, but it does physical damage instead, which is just the much better damage type, because the holo damage, even with the DLC, probably still is the worst damage type in the game. Now this one actually does scale off faith, whereas the other one scales off strength, so it does require different builds, but if you already have a faith-based build, there's lots of different AoEs you actually already have access to that are much better than Ground Slam in my opinion. Number 101, Glint's Blade Phalanx. Now this skill got nerfed way too hard in my opinion. It went from doing like almost 40 stance damage to less than 20, which is just like the only good thing that it actually had going for it, because the damage just sucks, the follow-up attack is not really that good, and it's probably just overall outclassed by Glintstone Pebble, as that one is going to be a much more easy to use type of skill with just more damage, because yeah, in its current state, I don't really value it that much. Still going to do a little bit of stance damage. You still get that access to the follow-up attack, which can do a bit more stance damage. But overall, I just don't really see much value in it. Number 100, Poisonous Mist. Now, poison as a status effect is pretty shit in this game, not gonna lie. It does like 6% damage over 90 seconds, which for comparison, the worst version of Scarlet Rot does like 16% damage over 90 seconds. So yeah, even though this thing can proc poison pretty quickly, it's not that good. Now, there can be one specific use of like pairing it alongside the poison-based buffs, like Candida Rot Exaltation Talisman or the Mushroom Crown. You could just like lead off a boss fight with this, have these buffs equipped, and for the next 20 seconds with any single type of build, you're just going to get a bunch more damage. You don't even necessarily have to have Poisonous Mist equipped onto your main weapon. But the thing is, with this type of playstyle, I'm probably better off using Chilling Mist instead, because Chilling Mist is going to give you a very similar benefit, but you're just going to proc the better status effect and just save on a talisman slot too. Number 99, Holy Ground. Now this is a shield-based skill that does summon this holy-based magic sigil on the ground, and when standing upon this magic sigil, you actually get a whole bunch of health regen and more damage negation, and the health regen is actually 18 health per second, which is more than Blessing of the Erd Tree, and you get 20% damage negation, which is also really good. Now the thing is, it involves you having to stand inside of this small circle, which if you're trying to stand inside this small circle, more likely than not, you're going to get hit because you're playing around doing that. So honestly, the whole thing is just counterintuitive. Now there might be some instances to where you can use some slower types of skills or the Iron Jar Aromatic, and this playstyle might be pretty good. But honestly, I think this skill would have benefited much more if it was like an aura buff, or if like the AoE was like 3 times as large. Number 98, Carrion Greatsword, which this is a very high damaging magic based skill. You can charge it up to do nice stance damage, really good damage. You don't really get any hype armor, might not be the easiest thing to use, but it definitely is amazing. Now the reason why it's still going to get lower in the C tier is because Carrion Grandeur outclasses it, and that's outclassed by Carrion Sovereignty. So yeah, it's just completely outclassed. 97, Shield Strike. Now this skill can be equipped onto the shield, and all it does is just give you the light attack combo for your skill. It doesn't actually consume any FP at all, but the main reason why it exists is because you can have your thrusting shield in your left hand, and when you click L2 or the skill based button, you can also do a light attack as well, and obviously just get the ability to block on top of this. Which the light attacks of the thrusting shields are actually pretty good. They do nice stance damage, they're pretty quick, they do piercing damage, but yeah, that's basically the only use of this Ash of War. 96, Storm Assault. Now this skill is probably going to be mainly for PvP, as it does like stun lock enemies and do like amazing damage, but in PvE, it basically stun locks nothing, even like enemies like Millennia or Knights, doesn't stagger them whatsoever, and honestly, it just sucks in terms of tracking. The damage is not really that good. There's a longer animation, you can get staggered out of it too. There are like plenty of other different types of like storm-based skills or other different types of smaller-based skills that can pair alongside a polearm weapon that are going to perform much better than this one. Number 95, Poison Mothflight. Now how this works is that when you proc poison on an enemy and use this skill, it does a flat percentage of damage, in this instance 5% damage, which is identical to the Poison Flower Blooms Twice skill in the DLC. Now that one is just going to be way better because it does more damage, lunges further, you can pair it alongside any weapon, also does Scarlet Rot, so it's just going to be the much better version. But even if that version didn't exist, I still would put this lower on the list because yeah, it's just not that good. It has a terrible lunge, you get no hype armor, the damage really isn't that good, and the whole concept just make it like a worse version than a bleed build because bleed just does way more percentage damage. Number 94, Golden Parry. Now, I have no idea why they nerfed this skill as much as they did, because it used to be like the best parry skill in the game, and parrying in this game was still pretty niche, so I don't really understand the change, but basically, it gets just as many parry frames now as a medium shield parry, which is like a very small amount, and it's going to be very hard to try and land a parry. Now, still, it actually does it at a distance for a small FP cost, but otherwise, I would just never really bother with it, because counter retaliation now just is going to be the much better version. Number 93, Vow of the Indomitable. Now this is a very niche shield-based skill in that it only gives you a bunch of iframes, which can be pretty good, but you're just staying in the one location. It gets pretty long recovery frames, so it's not like you can spam it over and over again to just get infinite iframes. So the only use that it does have is being able to like counter or just dodge these like lingering effect AoE attacks or some attacks that it is otherwise harder to dodge. You could just use this one to counter them, which is a very niche use, and even then is probably outclassed by the Raptor of the Mist skill. Number 92, Stamp Sweep, which this is one of a bunch of different types of like harder hitting skills that you can equip onto larger types of weapons, and I find this one to be one of the least valuable ones, as the animation is pretty long and the stance damage doesn't really make up for it either, and I just consider it to be directly outclassed by Stamp Upward Cut because that one is a bit quicker and can send enemies flying into the air. I kind of wish that these two skills were combined into one. That would have been really nice, but unfortunately that's not the case. Number 91, Mighty Shot. Now this is like the sniping based skill for like medium and small types of bows, which if you're going to be using a sniping based bow, great bows are just going to be much better at doing this. Now obviously these actually have higher strength requirements, so the dexterity build, you're probably better off with something like Mighty Shot, but even then I just rather have Rain of Arrows, as I believe that this skill just complements the weapons much better. Number 90, Earthshaker, which is a strength-based skill that does share the exact same animation as things like Golden Land and Waves of Darkness, but I'm gonna find those ones much more interesting as I do have a lot more things going for them, as this one is just like a short-range AoE attack, which compared to things like Ground Slam and Horror Luth's Earthshaker, I'm just gonna prefer those ones much more, as this skill does have a longer animation and less hyper armor. Number 89, Through and Through, which is one of the sniping based options for the great bows. Now this one is more so as like a collat based option because it can like pierce through enemies and actually hit multiple enemies at once, and actually is some like unique interactions with some arrows against larger types of bosses and that it can hit them multiple times. But I think things like Rain of Arrows could just do this exact same job but better. And also Egon's Drake Hunt, which is an Ash of War in the DLC, is like the much better version of a sniping based skill because it can just do more damage. But Through and Through is going to be in the base game, so you can just use this one until you actually get there. Number 88, Gravitas. Now, I don't value this skill whatsoever. It is like a short-range magic attack, doesn't do that good of damage, doesn't get any hyper armor, the stance damage is pretty poor as well, and the entire gimmick of sucking the enemy in towards you is honestly more of a downside if anything. And also, if you just wanted to go with this skill, I'd rather just go with the Alabaster's Lord Sword instead, because this version of the skill is just much better as it goes like twice as far, and just does way more damage too. Number 87, Lifesteal Fist. Now this skill can very well just cheese a lot of smaller enemies in the game, specifically things like knights and soldiers, because it actually does perform as a grab attack, and you can just like infinitely grab them over and over again and just get a whole bunch of damage off and actually get a whole bunch of health regen. Now the reason why it's still going to get this low on the list is because 90% of the enemies can't be grabbed, so it's like a very niche thing. You could just like have a secondary fist based weapon, just level it up, have Lifesteal Fist equipped onto it, and it's pro use it when you're struggling against some certain types of knights, but that's about it. Number 86, Warcry, which is one of a few different raw types of weapon buffs, all of which actually giving you a damage boost and changing up your heavy attack. Now, for the most part, it actually changes up your heavy attack for the worst, because in most cases, when you're actually using charged heavy attacks, you want to be able to stance break. And with Warcry heavy attack changes, it makes the animation last a lot longer. Now, there are some instances to where like the heavy attack is a lot better than what it used to be, specifically with things like polearms and whatnot. But I still think that Warcry is still outclassed by things like Braggart's Roar, because the heavy attack changes are basically the exact same, but Braggart's Roar just gives you a better damage boost, more defenses, and actually faster stamina recovery speed, whereas Warcry doesn't get anywhere near as many benefits, but Warcry is a faster animation, and you can only benefit off the skills by just having them one-handed, whereas Braggart's Roar you actually have to have the weapon two-handed. Number 85, Barrage. Now this is a bow-based skill that lets you just rapid fire a bunch of arrows. Now per arrow, the damage is going to be worse as is a status effect compared to like a regular arrow shot, but the DPS is still going to be overall higher, and so it's going to be really easy to use, and in most cases, it can actually like melt enemies somewhat quickly, but even then, it's still like an arrow, so it's not going to do as much damage as you would like, and it's not going to be as efficient as it's using like the regular bow movesets. Number 84, Rolling Sparks, which is probably the best skill to equip onto the perfume bottles, which really isn't saying much as I only really get a handful of options to begin with, but Rolling Sparks is still okay. It goes relatively far. It can actually explode multiple times. Against larger bosses, it's really good. Against smaller enemies, it is definitely not, because enemies like to move around a whole bunch. Rolling Sparks doesn't really have that tracking potential, and you're only going to be able to explode with like one or two different parts of the projectile, so it's just not good at all. And against larger bosses, you're better off just using the running heavy attacks with the perfume bottles, as they're actually pretty decent and definitely the best part about the weapon, but it actually does go pretty far with Rolling Sparks, so hitting like larger bosses at like a distance is probably going to be its only use. Number 83, Charge Forth, which is one of a handful of types of poking attack skills, and all the poking attack skills are really good. This one's probably better for PvP as it can like stun lock enemies, whereas in PvE, against enemies that cannot be staggered, is like borderline useless, and I'd just much rather have things like Impaling Thrust. And yes, it actually can hit multiple times with this skill, so maybe with like the multi-hit talismans or status effect builds, it can be pretty good, but I think something like Repeating Thrust or Blood Tax can just outclass this one. Number 82, White Shadow's Lure. Now this skill works very similar to the alluring skulls from the previous games, and that it throws out this little dummy for like enemies to get aggro towards. Now for stealth-based combat, things like Assassin's Gambit are probably just a lot better, but if you are in like the middle of a fight and enemies are aggroed towards you, you can just use this to redirect their attention, which would be pretty good for like most of the game, but to get it all the way in the Consecrated Snowfield, which definitely makes some of its usefulness a lot less important. Number 81, Sacred Ring of Light. Now this skill is a holy based projectile attack that you can consecutively cast over and over again with some polearm types weapons. Now the thing is, this skill is just completely outclassed by the Halo Scythe, because that version of the skill works very similar, but it just goes way further, staggers better, and does a bunch more damage for only 2 more FP cost. So if you actually liked this aesthetic, that is just going to be the much better weapon. But obviously this is an Ash of War, so you can infuse it into other different types of weapons. So if you actually were to fight enemies like weaker to fire damage or holy damage, you could always switch back and forth, but even then, something like Sacred Blade I'm probably just going to value more. Number 80, Raging Beast, which is a skill of the Beast Claws. It actually does do like this little iframing dodge into like a jumping attack. Now, the thing is, I don't value it much because it doesn't do that good of damage. It's a long animation. It has you jump into the air, which means that sometimes you can like jump into an attack. And the follow-up attacks also have a long animation and also just don't do as much damage. Like, I don't really know what they were really thinking with this thing to have it be such a long animation, no hyper armor, pretty poor damage, no stance damage. Like, it's pretty fun to use, but it kind of just sucks. Number 79, Spinning Weapon. Now, this skill can hit many times in quick succession, potentially proc status effects really quickly, can do some nice damage, and you also can like stand perpendicular to an enemy to hit with like the long part of the blade, especially if you're using things like polearm types weapons. Now, the thing is, I don't really care for it as much as other different types of spinning skills, so when you're actually using smaller types of weapons, I'd rather have things like Spinning Slash, because it can stun lock better, do more stance damage. With larger types of weapons, stuff like Stormcaller and Spinning Strikes are just going to do way more damage, more stance damage, better stun lock potential, and probably just be safer as well. So this one is okay, it's not too bad, but they're just much better options in my opinion. Now, getting into the B tier, this is going to consist of a bunch of like really average skills that sometimes probably have a couple of niche uses. Sometimes it means that they're actually really good, but they're probably just outclassed by something else. But getting in at number 78, we have Raptor of the Mists. Now, this is an iframe dodging skill that does result in a jump, which being able to immediately jump after an opening starts means you actually can just maximize your damage and get a whole bunch of attacks off potentially, so it can pair nicely alongside some jumping attack types of builds. Now, it does actually give you a bunch more iframes than you normally would with a dodge roll, so some types of attacks that are harder to dodge or that are basically impossible to dodge, you might be able to with Raptor of the Mists. Now, the thing is with this skill, I kind of wish I had a bit more going for it because it is pretty hard to actually land an attack when you're just jumping directly up and down. Because normally with jumping attacks, you actually can get some like lateral movement and actually jump pretty far forward. But with Raptor of the Mist, you're just going straight up and straight down. So in a lot of cases, you might just be able to miss. You also can't iframe dodge certain types of attacks and status effects, like Millennia's Healing, like the Malekith's Dust and Death effect. You can't be able to dodge those things at all with Raptor of the Mists. And I kind of wish it had like a bit of a damage boost, because like with skills in this game, they're so like broken and there's so many different types of weapon buffs that just help boost your damage that I feel like something like Raptor of the Mists could have been a bit more than just like an iframe dodge. Number 77, Determination, which is a very solid weapon buff. It boosts your damage by 60%, but it is only for your next attack, because after you hit them with it once, then it's just going to remove the effect and you have to reapply it, which it is a pretty quick animation, so it's not too bad, but it does pair very nicely alongside some charged heavy attack builds, which charged heavy attack builds, especially early on, are really good because you have access to the Spiked tier and the Axe Talisman, and all these three items you get right in Limgrave. So it actually can just break open the entirety of early game very easily with something like this. Now, the thing is, I'm not going to value it as much later in the game because things like Royal Nice Resolve exist. This is basically the exact same thing, but just 80% more damage instead. And you also can get access to stuff like Cragblade, which I'm probably going to prefer more with charged heavy attack builds too. Number 76, Lightning Ram, which yes, despite the memes of this thing looking kind of stupid, it actually is genuinely a good skill. It is a lightning skill, scales off dexterity, can do some really nice damage for only 5 FP per swing or per spin, and actually can be lowered to the ground as well, so a lot of attacks might end up going over your head, and the damage is actually really good. Now, it does have the downsides of obviously like being closer to the enemy, so it might be a bit risky. The starting animation might be a bit too long, the stamina cost might be too high, and I kind of wish it got boosted by things like the Death Knight set from the DLC, because it actually boosts a bunch of lightning skills, but this one is just not included for some reason. That would have been pretty nice. So it actually is a pretty fun and good skill to use. Nice lightning option for dexterity builds, probably the best one at that, but it probably just lacks a little bit more damage, and it might be a bit risky still. Number 75, Loretta's Slash. Now, this skill actually can lunge in pretty far, stun lock some smaller types of enemies, do okay damage, okay stance damage. Now, the thing is, there are probably other skills that could probably do this as well, that can also lunge in pretty far, but probably just do more damage, more stance damage, and just have better synergy with other different types of builds, because Loretta's Slash is a magic-based skill, so you're kind of limited in different types of infusions. Number 74, Barbaric Roar. Now, this is one of those skills that change up your heavy attack in this weapon buff, very similar to Warcry, and as I talked about that one, I don't really value them as much because it changes up your heavy attacks to have these longer animations, which they can do really nice damage, they can potentially stun lock nicely, but they're going to have longer animations, therefore they're not going to be able to stance break as quick, and it's kind of removing your only way to be able to do something like that. And also for Barbaric Roar, even though some different types of heavy attack options could be pretty nice, like with the great swords or the spears could be pretty funny and have some some nice stun lock potential, but I think Braggart's Roar is still going to outclass it outright because it does give you a better buff, and some of the pairings, especially with polearm types weapons, are just going to be much better. Number 73, Bloodhound's Step. Now, in a game where weapon skills do lots of damage or just give you really good buffs, it's pretty rare that you want to optimally build around a skill that just boosts your neutral game, which Bloodhound Step is pretty good. It's a nice dodge, can actually cover in a lot of distance really quickly, can actually help you retreat and actually gain a lot of distance. It could also be pretty good at dodging some attacks that otherwise are probably hard to dodge with a regular dodge roll, but sometimes with how far that it actually can dodge, you might just like overshoot your target and it's been in a really bad position. So there can be some instances to where Bloodhound Step is very useful, but I don't think the dodge roll is that bad to warrant me wanting to sacrifice really good damaging skills to use something like this. Number 72, Scattershot Throw. Now this is a skill that you can only equip onto this Smith's Grip Dagger. Now it does come passive with the Claws of Night, but being that's a unique weapon, I'm not going to talk about that. But Scattershot Throw is definitely the best option to pair alongside the Smith's Grip Daggers. Now I actually did talk about this weapon somewhat recently, and I consider it to be very underrated. You actually can do some nice damage with a Dexterity Infusion alongside the multi-hit talismans, and I think Scattershot Throw is like the perfect pairing, because one of the downsides of the Smith's Grip Daggers is that enemies can dodge it very easily, especially if they're skinnier and more mobile, and things like Scattershot Throw can help counteract that, as it does serve as like a nice AoE. If enemies like to dodge around, they're still going to hit, and at closer range it can stagger pretty well, potentially hit some headshots. It's like a nice complement to the weapon. It's not the most useful thing in the world. I probably still wouldn't recommend using it with a bleed-based infusion because the damage is really bad, and at that point you're better off just using the Claws of Night, but it still is very nice. Number 71, Stamp Upward Cut, which is a very high damaging type of skill that you can equip onto larger types of weapons. It does actually have some nice hype armor, can send enemies flying into the air, does some good stance damage. Now, am I going to value it more so than things like Lion's Claw or a Giant Hunt? Probably not. I would have valued it a lot more if it actually could be combined with the other different type of stamp skill and have stamp sweep and upward cuts together in one, have some more versatility, but for the most part, it's a bit too slow in my opinion for me to want to use it over things like Lion's Claw. Number 70, Lightning Slash. Now this is a skill that actually performs as a lightning close range AoE attack and actually can buff you up with more lightning damage for roughly 40 seconds. Now I think the buff is probably the best part about it. In early game, having a flat damage buff can be really good, but once you get later on in the game, it's definitely going to be less useful. And overall, I don't really care much for like the damage portion of this skill because it is like a close range attack that doesn't get much hype armor, somewhat of a longer animation and consumes a bit of FP. It can be a nice option for like dexterity type of builds, but I think there are lots of different other types of skills to pair alongside some quicker types of weapons that could just be better than this one. Number 69, Troll's Roar. Now this is definitely a very underrated skill in this game. It can only be equipable onto larger types of weapons, and there are two different parts to it. There is the roar effect and the big downward slam. Now this roaring effect is actually really good. It can send smaller enemies down to the ground, and it can do a total of 40 stance damage in a nice AoE, which is really good because you can just keep spamming this part over and over again. And if you do have the option or the opening to actually get the follow-up big slamming attack, you might as well just go for it. But in most cases, I wouldn't really bother with it because it doesn't really do that good of damage. It is like a really long animation, and in most cases, you're just going to take a bunch of damage in the meantime. But this like roar attack is actually really good. Number 68, Thunderbolts. Now this is a lightning-based projectile attack, does scale purely off dexterity. You can spam it over and over again for pretty cheap. The initial cast can be a bit too long, but if you actually just get into the momentum or just keep spamming it, you actually can output some decent amount of DPS. Now the stance damage or the stagger potential is probably going to be like the worst part about it, and it kind of makes me prefer like other different types of dexterity-based projectiles a bit more. Things like Beast Roar, Stormblade, Ice Spear, I'm probably going to value those a little bit more so than Thunderbolt, but if you did fight some enemies weaker to lightning damage, you could just switch to this one. Number 67, Hoarfrost Stomp, which is a cold-based skill that you can get relatively early on in the game. It does serve as a nice AoE, does some decent damage, can proc frost pretty quickly. But yeah, it's very easy to use, it's cheap, it can't really go too wrong. I think like the worst parts about it is going to be its total damage. It's not going to get too high, and it's going to be outclassed by Divine Beast Frost Stomp, which is in the DLC. This is just like a much better version. Basically the exact same attack, but it just can be fully charged to do more damage, and actually does do at least some stance damage, because regular Hoarfrost Stomp literally does 0 stance damage. 66, Ground Slam, which is a very decent AoE attack, as I talked about earlier with Golden Slam. Basically the exact same thing, nice hype armor, good stance damage. It's a good pairing alongside some smaller types of weapons that otherwise don't get the ability to stance break pretty quickly, and this one can do it for you. Now it is going to primarily scale off the strength stat, which might be a bit of a downside if you were to use some smaller, quicker types of weapons that might scale better off dexterity. And also I just consider it to be outclassed by Horror Luth's Earthshaker, which it might be a bit more risky. You don't really get as much hype armor as does ground slam, but you can just get way more damage and way more stance damage in a larger AoE, and you also get a bit later in the game, so ground slam does have its uses, but it still might be a little bit outclassed. Number 65, Shared Order. Now this is an aura buff that actually does boost your damage, very similar to Golden Vow, but actually doesn't really boost it for as much damage. Golden Vow is about 12% damage, this one being 10% damage, but it actually does last 15 seconds longer. So sometimes in some boss fights, you're probably better off just using something like this instead, because more likely than not, the fight's gonna last longer than 45 seconds. However, it actually doesn't boost your defenses, unlike Golden Vow, so I don't really consider it to be as useful, but it actually does have the secondary effect of doing bonus damage to undead enemies. So skeletons or deathbirds, you're going to do 50% more damage to these enemies with a skill like this one, and it's an aura buff, so you're going to slap it onto a dagger, use the skill, switch back to your main weapons, and has benefit of just much more damage to these enemies. Now, the Golden Epitaph buff does this like way better. It boosts it by like 100% more damage, which is like literally twice as effective. Now that one actually does require a little bit of faith investment, but I still recommend us going with that one if you just do have a little bit of faith. Number 64, Flame Skewer. Now this is a flame art based skill from the DLC. Does share a very similar animation to Giant Hunt, but it's not going to be anywhere near as good in terms of damage, stance damage, nor does it send enemies flying into the air like that. But it actually does get a follow-up fire attack, which is going to scale primarily off faith, and it can do some nice damage, do like an additional 15 stance damage, which is pretty good, and also buff the weapon with more fire damage for about 15 seconds, which is okay. Now for the most part, I just consider this to be outclassed by Flame Spear, because Flame Spear also does buff the weapon, but it buffs it for like 40 seconds. It's also going to buff it faster for less FP, have a faster animation, also has the ability to be fully charged, which actually does turn it into a projectile attack and just ultimately make it do more damage as well. So I just think that one is just a better option overall. This one can like stun lock a little bit better and can like initially come at a bit faster, but I just think that Flame Spear is just going to be the better one. Number 63, Savage Claws, which is one of the skills that is for the Beast Claws, and I think this is the best pairing for this weapon, as it does actually stun lock enemies very nicely, can hit multiple times in quick succession, help proc the multi-hit talismans, it actually can proc status effects really quickly. You do get stuck in somewhat of a longer animation, but thankfully you actually can cancel the last part of it, so it's not really that risky. Now for the most part, I just think Beast Claws are just like outclassed by regular claws, due to them just getting way higher DPS, and even if you do account for the skill, it's still not going to get as much. Now the stun lock potential is there, but if I wanted to use a Beast Claw, I'd rather just go with a Red Bear's Claw, because the skill of this weapon is somewhat similar, but it can just stun lock better and its output much higher damage, so it's okay, but it's still a little bit outclassed. Number 62, Golden Lands. Now this is a holy based skill that you can only equip onto larger types of weapons, and it is actually a nice little 2-for-1 type of skill. It serves as like a short range AoE attack, and it can be like a nice sniping option as well. Now the fact that it does do holy damage is going to be a downside, due to like a lot of enemies in the base game just being very resistant to it. Now thankfully in the DLC, it actually has gotten a bit better, due to like some enemies being weaker to it, and there's more buffs that you can pair alongside with this. And you can also pair this weapon alongside the Great Stars to actually get some more health regen for every single one of these projectiles, which is pretty cool. Now, for the most part, you're going to be spec'd into a faith build when using this, because it does scale purely off faith. And if you have faith build, you're going to be using some spells. And is Golden Lands better than like a lot of different sniping options out there, like Frenzied Burst? Probably not. And there are probably some better AoE spells that you could use, or other different types of holy spells that could probably just cover this niche anyway. But it can actually just cover 2 different things for once, and so you probably can just save on some memory slots just by having this skill equipped. But it's still not going to be like the most amazing thing in terms of damage or stance damage or anything. Number 61, Glintstone Pebble, which is like a very generic, basic magic projectile attack. It obviously is going to scale purely off intelligence. The skill doesn't really go that far. It might still eventually end up being outclassed by the spells, as the spells could just eventually just do more damage, depending on which staff that you do have. But this could be like a very solid early game option. Projectiles just cheese the entire game, in my opinion. You don't have to stick close to enemies. You can just like set it a further distance. And Glintstone Pebble also gets the option of a follow-up attack, which can do some nice damage and some nice stance damage. Now, for the most part, I think this skill is just directly outclassed by the Glintstone Chris skill, as a Glintstone Dart is just, it can be fully charged, so it can go way further and just do way more damage. But this one obviously can be infused onto multiple different weapons, so if you didn't want to use a dagger, you could just pair it alongside something like a straight sword. But I think there are better projectiles out there that also just scale with magic and just do magic damage that could just perform better than this one. Number 60, Egon's Drake Hunts. Now this is like the sniping based skill for your great bows. It does do more damage than things like through and through. Now unfortunately you get it all the way in the DLC, but great bows as a sniping based option are pretty good. They go really far, and this one is just the best one to use. So you can just aim at their head, and in most cases you're just going to be able to kill like trash mobs in just one hit. it's actually a pretty decent option if you are going to go through like some legacy dungeons or just like explore the overworld. There actually are some bosses that can be cheesed by this type of skill as well, but for the most part, with this longer animation, it's not going to be like the most useful thing in like the heat of battle. Number 59, we have Beast's Roar, which this is a dexterity-based projectile attack. Actually does go pretty far, do some very nice damage. Like, this thing can cheese the entire game. Like, I've done playthroughs with all these Ashes of War, and this one was definitely one of the easiest ones. But the reasons why it's still going to get lower on the list is because I still consider it to be outclassed by Stormblade, as Stormblade does actually go pretty far as well, but it just stun locks a lot better, does more stance damage, actually has a hitbox at closer range, and this can be spammed consecutively a lot faster than Beast Roar can. Now, Beast Roar is not going to be completely useless because Beast Roar can be equipped with basically every single weapon in the game. It can actually go a lot further than things like Stormblade can. And also, you actually can get more buffs for it earlier on in the game, like the Raw Medallion could help boost it, and things like the Highland Axe as well. So it's not that bad of an option, but it's probably still, once again, a bit outclassed. Number 58, Sword Dance, which is a pretty decent multi-hit type of skill. You actually can equip it on things like halberds and great axes, which is pretty funny. Can close in the gap nicely, can do an okay amount of damage. Now, getting stuck in this longer animation doesn't really necessarily mean it's like the best thing in the world. Also, the follow-up attack can be a bit too slow. The stance damage really isn't quite there. And it's to the point that I'd rather have things like Spinning Slash, Stormcaller, or Spinning Strikes if I just wanted to output more damage or get more stance damage. But this one actually does lunge in pretty far, but I think that's its only use, and the fact that it's like pretty flashy to use as well. Number 57, Waves of Darkness. Now, this is a skill that's very similar to things like Golden Land and Earthshaker, basically identical animation. You have to use a large weapon, slam it into the ground, and it creates like this big AoE. And in this instance, it's going to be like a big gravity magic-based AoE attack, obviously going to scale off intelligence, and the AoE can actually go out pretty far. Actually shoots out periodically over like a few seconds, so actually can help stun lock smaller enemies for longer. The damage itself is not going to be too high. Now, thankfully, if you actually pair it alongside a Cold Infusion, these magic wave attacks actually can help proc Frost as well, which could be a pretty cool and interesting pairing. But for the most part, still like is somewhat of a longer animation, and I feel like it does lack a bit in the damage department too. Number 56, we have Savage Lion's Claw. Now, this skill, if you did consider it to be an upgrade to regular Lion's Claw, I don't think that it actually is, because regular Lion's Claw can just do more damage and more stance damage in one hit, and also just like flatten enemies to the ground. Now, Savage Lion's Claw can like lunge a little bit further, and you do get the option of a follow-up attack that actually does hit like a second and third time, and in this instance, it can also flatten enemies to the ground, do more damage, and do basically just as much stance damage. But there aren't going to be many bosses out there that actually let you have an opening for that long, and if they do, you're probably just going to be better off just using 2 Lion's Claw attacks, which is one, probably not going to be as efficient, but it's going to help you do way more damage and way more stance damage. Now, Savage Lion's Claw can hit like multiple times with the follow-up attacks, so it might be better with like the multi-hit talismans or status effects maybe, but it's like a very small niche use, and for the most part, I just don't really consider it to be as good as Lion's Claw. So yes, once again, another like B-tier option that's just inevitably outclassed. Number 55, we have Carrying Retaliation, to what I consider the best parry skill in the game, and parrying in this game I still consider to be somewhat niche because a lot of enemies cannot be parried, and the ones that can be parried require multiple successful attempts, and even in those instances, stance breaking builds are probably just going to do you better, but there are some cases where like parrying can just be really easy to pull off, and this one is just going to do it the best, because when you slap this on like either a medium shield or a small shield, you're actually going to get some of the most, if actually the most parry frames compared to every other different type of parry, and it also doesn't consume any types of FP as well, unless you actually do parry and deflect projectile attacks, specifically like magic or like spell-based projectiles. You actually can turn it into your own attack itself, which can be okay for some cases, but like it's not going to do like the most amazing damage. But yeah, for the most part, if you're using this type of skill, it's just to be able to use it as a regular parry. Number 54, Overhead Stance, which this skill is only equipable onto the Great Katana, and just like all stance-based skills, they can be really good and output a high amount of damage. Now, this one I still consider to be the worst of the stance-based skills, because all the other ones will probably typically get good stance damage, which I think this thing definitely lacks. Like that triple swinging attack that you see, it only gets like roughly 20 stance damage, and that single swipe only gets roughly 10 stance damage. I kind of wish like that one of these attacks was like a high stance damaging attack, and the other one was just meant for just raw damage. That would have helped it out a lot more, because the way that it stands right now, this skill is just outclassed by things like repeating thrust and blood tax, because those can actually hit more times, help proc the multi-hit talismans better, gets more bleed build-up, and also just be able to just get piercing damage, which is just a better damage type more so than slashing damage, which you kind of already get a lot of with the Great Katana. Now, the existence of the Rolana's cameo actually does make this somewhat useful, because with the Rolana's cameo, it actually can outdamage things like blood tax and repeating thrust, but that only involves you having to have that talisman equipped, which is another talisman slot, and you have to charge it up first, so that is like an additional second. So overall, you get stuck in a longer animation due to having to charge it up, and the benefits are not really as great as things like repeating thrust or blood tax in my opinion. Number 53, we have Flame of the Redmanes. Now, yes, this skill was nowhere near as good as it used to be, because just like Glintblade Phalanx, it actually did get nerfed to its stance damage a whole bunch. But thankfully, it still is somewhat decent, as it does serve as a nice AoE projectile attack that does scale purely off strength, because it is a fire-based skill. So if you do have like a strength-based build, and you are lacking like some fire damage option or like a projectile option, you could go with something like this. And if you pair it alongside the Freya's Greatsword, it actually can help boost the damage even further, which is pretty nice. I just think it was nerfed a bit too hard in my opinion in terms of stance damage, and also things like Flaming Strike exists, which is like another skill that scales off strength that works somewhat similar. The AoE projectile doesn't go as far, but the follow-up attack obviously can just make it do more damage, more stance damage, and buff the weapon, but not every single weapon can use Flaming Strike, so it's not completely useless. 52, Dry Leaf Whirlwind. Now this is a skill that you can only equip onto the hand-to-hand arts, and it actually is this nice kicking flurry attack. Does do some nice damage. It can stun lock all these smaller enemies like knights really well, and it can cheese basically every single one of them. Can do some nice status build up. Now against some like bosses that or enemies that cannot be staggered, or just larger enemies in general, I would never really use this thing, especially against those larger enemies, because it spins like way slower and attacks way slower than it otherwise normally would against smaller types of enemies. And it's to the point that I would just rather just use like the actual combos of the weapon, and I think like the heavy attack combos can just do like a very similar job. So if I actually were to use a skill for the hand-to-hand art, I'd much rather have things like Palm Blast, as I think that skill can just better complement the weapon. Okay, now getting into the A tier, this is going to be the stuff that's just all really good. There's lots of good stuff. Sometimes it might not be as good as some other things. Maybe it's only good at certain parts of the game. Might still be a little bit outclassed, but it's good. But at number 51, we have Repeating Thrust, which this is one of many poking attack types of skills. This one being really good at stun locking and proccing status effects. And against all smaller types of enemies, this can just very well cheese them. Only gives him 7 FP and you're just stun locking for days. Now against larger types of bosses, I probably wouldn't really bother, because you do get stuck in a longer animation and you're probably not going to be winning that trade, and I'd rather switch to things like Impaling Thrust or Piercing Fang instead in these instances. But you can put this skill alongside stuff like the Sword Lance or Great Katanas, which these get really high amounts of AR and really good status build up, and it can just be like a very broken pairing even against these larger types of bosses that is not going to stand a chance. Now the reasons why I'm not going to put it into the S tier is because I consider Blood Tax to be the better alternative. It is the identical animation, doesn't really get as much damage, but it does give you a bunch of health regen back. And also Blood Tax does get boosted by the Arnspark set, and the damage difference when having this set equipped is not that big, but this one still just does more raw damage and also just consumes like half the amount of FP. At 50, we have Rain of Arrows, which this I consider to be the best skill to equip onto all different types of bows. Doesn't matter what it is, light, medium, great bows. This is just the one, because it is actually makes you do really respectable damage, and it's incredibly efficient. They only consume 1 arrow, and you're just like raining down like 30 different arrows from the sky. And against larger bosses, it's just doing amazing damage, especially if you're using a great bow. And you can also help proc status effects quickly. But yeah, they don't even have to be that large. Even like a slightly large enemy, it could do pretty nicely. Even against smaller enemies, it can like somewhat stun lock them. It is really good and a nice solid complement to your bows, which are a pretty decent weapon class for the most part, and is probably because of this skill. Number 49, we have Eruption, which is a skill for larger types of weapons. Actually does serve as some like magma-based AoE attack. Does primarily scale off the strength stat as well. So if you are lacking some fire damage with a strength-based build, you could use something like this. And as of the DLC releasing, you actually can get 15% more damage with a skill like this due to the Talisman of the Dread. And the damage can be really good. It kind of lacks in a bit of stance damage. It is a close range skill with a longer animation. So against a lot of different bosses, especially in the DLC, it might not perform the best because they just don't really give you that long of an opening. But there are some bosses to where I probably would rather switch to this one, specifically the ones that are weaker to fire damage. But outside of that, there are other different types of like slower skills that you can put onto larger weapons that you probably see later on this list that can just perform better. Number 48, Shield Crash. Now, I see this one as like the direct upgrade to Shield Bash, because as I mentioned with that skill, it's going to be paired nicely alongside some smaller types of weapons that kind of struggle in staggering these larger types of enemies like knights and whatnot, and Shield Crash can just straight up just stun lock them and then send them flying to the ground, and also can do very nice damage depending on what type of shield that you have. If you have a great shield and paired alongside status effects, it actually can be a pretty decent primary based option, but I think that's its only use, and with shields being as niche that they are in this type of game, I can't really put it any higher. Number 47, Sacred Order. Now, this is a weapon buff that just boosts your damage by 10%. Now, the thing is, a lot of other weapon buffs in the game, things like Crag Blade, Royal Knight Resolve, Braggart's Roar, they're probably just going to end up being better weapon buffs for a skill. But the good thing about Sacred Order is that it actually puts the buff onto both hands. So you actually can put Sacred Order weapon like a dagger in your offhand, use the skill, and then your main hand is also going to gain a 10% damage boost. So if you actually wanted to go like a skill-based build, you're just going to get 10% more damage this way. And this also does work with your spells. Now, typically with spells, they're always going to have like a staff or a seal to boost the damage anyway, so you're probably better off going with something like that. Now, if there is a spell that actually doesn't get a catalyst to boost the damage, you could just go with something like this. And also with skill-based builds, this is like another way to optimize it. Now, this actually does involve you having to just have a dagger equipped at all times, because as soon as you remove it, you lose the buff. So if you wanted to two-hand the weapon, it's not going to be something that's for you, but it actually does give you the ability to do bonus damage against undead enemies. So skeletons, deathbirds, this is just another way to just melt them really quickly. You just use the skill, have your main weapon equipped, and you can just get a bunch more damage against these deathbirds. At 46, we have Bloody Slash, which this is a like medium range blade-based projectile attack. Actually does scale purely off arcane, and no hitting with it like a point blank range doesn't make it do bonus damage, as like it doesn't actually have a weapon hitbox. It's just purely a projectile attack, and the damage can be really nice. The bleed buildup can be there as well. It's probably just meant for like just maximum damage in one hit with an arcane type of build. It's probably better alongside some smaller types of weapons, because otherwise with lots of weapons you can't really equip them with them anyway, and you're probably just better off going in a different direction. Things like Bloodblade just come to mind, as it would probably just going to be cheaper in terms of like HP costs, because this thing actually does decrease your HP, and probably just work better as a projectile attack and even at point blank range. But maximum damage in one hit, the stagger potential is there, and also it's going to be like your earliest blade skill that you can acquire. So if you actually wanted to have like a blade based weapon early on in the game, this is going to be your best option. Number 45, Quick Step. Now, just like Bloodhound Step, this is like very similar. I see it the same way. Now, I do prefer Quick Step a little bit more because it is easier to spam. It's cheaper, less recovery frames, so there's less chances of actually getting hit. It also doesn't dodge as far as Bloodhound Step, but that could also be a positive because of one, things like backstepping attacks. Typically, when you actually use a backstep in Elden Ring, you don't really get iframes unless you use the talisman from the DLC. So if you actually want to utilize backstepping attacks, you could just dodge backwards with Quick Step, and that could just result in as a better, different type of attack. And also, you're just not going to really be able to like overshoot your target sometimes, where Bloodhound Step could. But Bloodhound Step obviously has the use of being able to like close a gap quickly or to retreat really quickly. But the same thing, I just rather have damaging based skills because my dodge roll is not really that bad in this game. Number 44, Seppuku. Now, this is a very solid blade-based weapon buff. Actually does scale off the arcane stat. So going into an occult infusion with a weapon that already gets passive bleed is going to be the best pairing in my opinion. Because yeah, with a regular bleed infusion, I wouldn't really bother with it because the base bleed build-up for Seppuku is not that good. And with bleed infusions, you don't really get that good of an arcane scaling. So it's not the best benefit. But you could potentially use it still if you are power stancing. You could just have one of the weapons with Seppuku, because at the very least, when you use it upon yourself, it does proc bleed on you, and with that instance you actually can pair it alongside a lot of blood excitation and the white mask and actually help proc those buffs. But yeah, the best pairing for a skill like this would be with like a Scavenger's Curve Sword or a Cross Laginata, as they do get passive bleed and are best paired with those occult infusions. Number 43, we have Chilling Mist. Now, this skill is not meant to be a primary option by any means, because all it does serve is as a weapon buff. And if you were to make your weapon cold infused or require a different build, you're expecting to intelligence, you're going to have access to frost anyway. But the whole purpose of this skill, in my opinion, is to just be slapped onto a dagger and paired alongside any build that doesn't already have access to frost. So it's like a strength-based build, faith build, arcane build. You just benefit of using Chilling Mist because you can just lead off the boss fight with this Ash of War slapped onto a dagger, and then you actually end up debuffing them, make them take 10% damage, and make them take 20% more damage over the next 20 seconds. Now, if you actually were going to go with a fire-based build, I wouldn't bother with Chilling Mist because obviously the fire is going to reset the frost, and we don't want that. But if you did feel like you were lacking some damage against bosses, I would honestly give Chilling Mist a go. Number 42, Carrion Grandeur, which is a magic-based skill very similar to how I saw the Carrion Greatsword. This one is just going to be the better version because it can be charged up a third time and it's do monstrous amounts of damage, really good stance damage. It can go really far as well. Like, as long as you have the opening to use a skill like this, it can just destroy every single boss in the game. Now, the only reason why it's going to get lower on the list is because it is eventually outclassed by Carrion Sovereignty, which yes, you do get in the DLC a bit later into the game, but it is just the better version. So in the base game, I'll do something like this and then just eventually switch. Number 41, we have Double Slash. Now, this is a very good multi-hit type of skill, can output some nice amounts of damage, probably best paired alongside some status effect types of builds. Now, this actually does have two different variants. There's one for like large weapons like great swords and halberds, and there's one for like the smaller weapons like curved swords and katanas. Now, I definitely prefer the quicker based version instead, as it just does have much quicker animations, and it has benefits of this better status effect buildup due to its faster animations. And for the most part, if I were to use it with things like curved swords and katanas, it would only be if I'm going all into a status effect, because for the most part, if I'm using a katana, I think Unsheath is just a much better option. And with the curved sword, I think things like Spinning Slash is a better option, because they also just do give you the ability to get some nice stance breaks. But with Double Slash, it does actually swing a bit faster, so it's probably better for those status builds. But I think that's going to be its only use, because with every other different weapon type, I don't really value it as much. Number 40, Assassin's Gambit, which this is probably the best stealth-based tool in the entire game. It makes your character partially invisible and silences footsteps, and it's to the point that you can just go through entire like legacy dungeons without even being spotted at all. Even if you try and like run and sprint through them, a lot of enemies will not be aggroed. Like, this thing is genuinely amazing. I always just recommend just having Assassin's Gambit just slapped onto a really light weapon. Just leave it in your inventory in any single instance where you feel like you need to stealth past some enemies because you're low health and there's a bunch of challenging enemies up ahead. You could just use something like this. Also, it is very handy in this like challenge runs in general, but even in just like regular playthroughs, I definitely find lots of value in this. Number 39, Horrorluth's Earthshaker. Now, out of all like the strength-based AoE attacks, I consider this one to be the best one, as it does just get you amazing amounts of damage and just really good stance damage. Like, the entire skill can easily do like over 40 to 50 stance damage, and it can just be amazing, especially if you have a long enough opening. You also get lots of hyper armor. It can stun lock with like the initial roar attack. Like, it's just really good. Any single time you're surrounded by a bunch of trash mobs, this thing can just clear them out all easily. And I think the best part about it is that it can be paired with basically every single weapon. You can slap it onto a dagger, colossal weapon, even a whip. Like, this thing is really just that good. Now, it does just only scale off the strength stat, which I kind of would like to pair this alongside smaller types of weapons, because with large weapons, you already get access to really good stance damage anyway. So we are better pairing with things like potentially curved swords, daggers, maybe even thrusting swords. But you're going to have to go into a strength build just to be able to use something like this. And also, it does have a real long animation, so it's not going to be the most useful thing in most parts of the game, but it still is deserving of a very solid A tier. Number 38, Aspect of the Crucible Wings. Now, there are two different variants of this skill. There is one that actually does a poking attack, and another one with the twin blades that actually does this flurry attack. Now, as for the poking attack one, I kind of see it similar to how I see things like Piercing Fang and Impaling Thrust, in that it's like a lunging-based poke. Now, this one is like the slow version of Impaling Thrust and Piercing Fang. It actually does lunge in really far, but it actually does do more damage in a longer animation. Now, I probably still consider things like Piercing Fang and Impaling Thrust to be better, because those ones have much faster animations and actually can just do more stance damage too. But Crucible Wings can be infused onto a Colossal Sword, which is actually very interesting because I don't really get as many poking attack types of options. They only really get things like Giant Hunt, which is actually really good. But this one can actually lunge in really far, do some okay amounts of damage, but with this long animation, it might be a bit too risky. Now, and as for the Twin Blade version, I probably don't really like this one as much unless I'm fighting like larger types of enemies, because against smaller enemies, it can just like overshoot the target and then like half the attacks are just going to miss and it's do really bad damage. But when you pair it alongside status effects, mainly being Blood Flame Blade, actually can do some nice damage. I kind of wish there was like an infusible Twin Blade that had passive bleed. It would have made for a much better pairing. But for the most part, this type of playstyle might still be outclassed by things like a charged heavy attack build or a power stance jumping attack build that the Twin Blades have, but it still is really cool to have. And again, some bosses actually can make very quick work of them too. Number 37, Shriek of Sorrow, which is a weapon buff skill that you do get in the DLC, and upon using it, it actually does boost your damage by 10%. Now, the thing is, the lower health that you go, the more damage that you actually do receive. And it's to the point that when you're below 25% health, you get a 30% damage boost, which is by far like the best damage buff if you don't include things like Determination and Roll Not Resolve, because those are only for just one hit. But for an extended period of time, it doesn't really get much better than this, like 30% more damage for your weapons, and it lasts 40 seconds in a really quick animation. It's really good. Now, obviously, it has to be like very situational, because it's only beneficial what you do get at like lower levels. Otherwise, you just use things like Cragblade instead. But a good thing is that when you are at these lower levels and use the skill, you can just heal with your flask and still retain the same amount of buff. Now, even then, I would probably still use things like Cragblade because it lasts longer. It gives you like a flat 15%. You don't have to worry about like casting it at lower health, which might be a bit more risky. It also boosts your stance damage as well. And it still is a physical damaging buff, which is the same thing as Shriek of Sorrow. But Shriek of Sorrow is still going to get this high for the main reason that there's actually a lot of weapons, specifically in the DLC, that can't be buffed with Cragblade, but can be buffed with this. So all like the Smith script weapons, they can't be buffed with Cragblade. Things like your hand-to-hand art, they also cannot be buffed. The Golem Fists, the only way to actually get a weapon buff with these types of weapons is to use something like Shriek of Sorrow. So like it is going to be very useful for these types of things, but for the most part, I think Cragblade is the better option. At number 36, Sacred Blade. This is a holy-based projectile attack, does come out pretty fast, does do some nice damage, it's very easy to use, not that expensive. It also just does boost your weapon with this 80 more holy damage for like the next 40 seconds, which is really nice, and you can get it very early on in the game. Now the thing is, holy damage throughout the base game, not going to be the most useful thing, but thankfully in the DLC, there are a bunch more enemies that are weaker to it, and there are just different types of buffs that you can pair alongside with this to just make it do even more damage. But the thing is, with faith-based builds, you always just want to go back and forth between Sacred Infusions and Flame Art Infusions, depending on which boss that you do fight, and I think Sacred Blade is just the best Sacred-based skill. A lot of weapons can use it, and if you wanted to go with these Sacred Infusions, I would just slap on this thing. Number 35, Spinning Gravity Thrust. Now, if the Millennia's Great Rune was more accessible, I would honestly put this bad boy into the S tier, because this thing can just output monstrous amounts of damage. You could put it onto a Colossal Sword, which is just crazy. Obviously get access to piercing damage, get really good status build up, good stance damage, it can send enemies flying. Now, like the major downside is that you get stuck in a really long animation, specifically that first part. The recovery frames are really long, it takes forever to land to the ground, and it's to the point that if you just did the follow-up attack, it might honestly just be a bit faster, and you're just going to benefit of more damage too. Now, the entire FP cost might be a bit too high, but yeah, there's still that long animation is what's going to hurt it. Hence me saying that Millennia's Great Rune is going to be an amazing pairing, because pairing it alongside this just makes it broken. You get like all your health back instantly, and you can trade it with every single boss due to its infinite hyper armor. So against some smaller enemies that can be staggered, it's probably going to be more useful, but against larger bosses that is going to hit you throughout the entire animation, I probably wouldn't use it unless I do have the Millennia's Great Rune. Number 34, Swift Slash. Now, this is a skill of the backhand blades, and unfortunately, it has gotten nerfed to the point where I no longer consider it to be an S tier, and there also is a bug alongside with this that stops me from putting it higher as well. Now, the skill still goes really far, not as far as it used to, but it goes far enough for it to still be a good option, obviously only when fully charged, and when fully charged, it actually hits multiple times, and actually helps proc status effects pretty quickly, does some decent damage. You actually can use it as like a mix-up. If you feel like you're going to attack into danger, you could like redirect it and just dodge back into safety again. It does work pretty well. Now, unfortunately, this fully charged effect is actually somewhat bugged as well, specifically against larger bosses. Sometimes the aftershock wave effect just completely misses, and you're only doing like half the amount of damage, which is like very frustrating because you want to use it fully charged in most cases to maximize the damage and maximize the stance damage, and you're just missing out on a whole bunch of it. So if that actually did get fixed, it might end up being a bit higher, but as it stands right now, it's probably not the best option for the backhand blades. Number 33, Vacuum Slice. If you're using a Colossal Sword and you feel like you are lacking a projectile option, I would honestly go with Vacuum Slice. Now, it's not going to do as well as things like Stormblade, because Stormblade can go just as far, but be faster, actually probably end up doing higher DPS, be cheaper as well, actually track upwards, whereas Vacuum Slice does not, and those things can be boosted by the In-Range Divine Beast Talisman, but Vacuum Slice can be infused onto a Colossal Sword, where Stormblade cannot. So this is going to be the best projectile option, and it still is really good. It goes relatively far. It does do more damage and more stance damage in one hit than things like Stormblade would. It still actually gets a hitbox at closer range. The hitboxes themselves for the projectile attack might be a bit weird. If you fight on like some like weird terrain, the projectile can just like vanish and just disappear and just not end up hitting the target, which might be a bit frustrating, but it still is an otherwise amazing option for the Colossal Swords. Might not be as good as things like Lion's Claw and whatnot, but the projectile can make it very easy to use. Number 32, Endure, which is definitely one of the more underrated skills in the game, and if you were having problems like reading enemies' movesets and you didn't get to memorize them at all and you just wanted to face tank and just trade out, Endure is probably going to be the option for you, because not only does this thing give you immense amounts of poise, but it also gives you 45% damage negation across the board to every single damage type. Now, the skill only does last 3 seconds, but thankfully it is actually a really quick animation and doesn't consume much FP. Now, for larger types of weapons, I wouldn't really care for it, because larger weapons already get hyper armor, and it actually is a longer animation, and with like the slower attacks, it might not be the best thing. So definitely best pairs alongside some smaller types of weapons, things like fists or curved swords, straight swords, doesn't matter matter what it is, this could be a very solid pick. But yeah, if you were struggling to actually engage with bosses or struggling to get particular types of spells off that didn't get hyper armor, you could just use Endure first and just have at the boss and just probably end up winning the engagement. Number 31, Spectral Lance, which is a polearm-based skill. It's a projectile that does scale off Arcane, which might make it a bit limited, but thankfully Arcane builds are still good. Now the reasons why I consider this to be a high A tier is because it's a projectile attack that goes really far. It actually has tracking. It tries to track towards the head, which when you get headshots, you just do bonus damage and bonus stance damage, which is probably the best part about this skill in its stance damage, because it does at least 25 stance damage, which doing 25 stance damage at this further distances is honestly just ridiculous. You could also pair it alongside the Arrow Reach Talisman for it to go even further. It works with the Smithing Talisman too to make it do more damage, and it only consumes 9 FP, which is just absurd. Now, I don't think it's the most broken thing, because I think the damage is definitely a bit on the lower end. It could use a little bit more, which you could like fully charge it. That would have been nice, would have definitely helped out in the damage department, but I think that's the only downside, and otherwise just an amazing skill. Number 30, Phantom Slash, which this is a pole blade based skill that actually does double as both a projectile attack and like some lunging base attack. It actually does shoot out a phantom, then you both follow it, and you actually do get an option of a follow-up attack as well. Like the entire combo can do some really nice damage. You don't really get as much hyper armor, nor is the stance damage really that's good either, but it actually does have a bunch of things going for it. And that one, it is very efficient. Two, even if you do get staggered, the phantom is actually guaranteed to come out, and the skill ceiling is actually really high with a skill like this, because you actually can just shoot the phantom into one direction, and you can actually like dodge yourself into safety, or you actually can hit multiple enemies at once, because you can have the phantom hit one, then you can hit another, and you can also have like the follow-up attack redirect too. So like the skill ceiling of this skill is actually really high, and actually is really fun to use. Might not be like the best thing in the game, but I still is deserving of an A tier. Number 29, Divine Beast Frost Stomp, which this is like the upgraded version of Hoarth Frost Stomp, in that it is like a cold-based AoE, and cold-based skills do scale off both dexterity and intelligence. Now with an intelligence-based build, I wouldn't really care for it much, because with your sorceries, you already have access to like AoEs and frost-based skills, but with a dexterity build, it can actually be very good, because you don't really have access to both of these things. So with Divine Beast Frost Stomp, with how easy it is to use, the fact that it can be fully charged, it's good frost build-up, when paired alongside the stomping-based buffs, can actually output some nice amounts of damage, and I think best of all yet, you can pair it with basically every single weapon type in the entire game. It's probably not going to be like the best option if you have the ability to use things like Ice Spear. That just might be the better frost-based skill, and there are probably other different skills in the game that can just output more damage, but just having a nice AoE option that's as easy to use as this one, you can't really go wrong. Number 28, Spinning Slash. Now there are 3 different variants of this skill, one for polearms, one for large weapons like curved greatswords, and there's one for smaller weapons like straight swords, curved swords, katanas, things like that. And I think the smaller and quicker based skill of Spinning Slash is going to be best, because with the larger types of weapons, they're probably better with other different types of skills like Stormcaller and whatnot, but for Spinning Slash, there really isn't anything that's too comparable that the smaller weapons already have. Now, if I do have like a katana or a straight sword, I'm probably better off having things like Unsheath and Square Off, because those are just really good at stance breaking. And also, I think Impaling Thrust is going to be the better stance breaking option as well, if you didn't have access to those other 2 different types of skills. But Spinning Slash does actually have the ability to just stun lock a bit better, and also it can hit it multiple times, so it could help proc the status effects, proc the multi-hit talismans. It could do well in that area. It might not do as well as like power extending really quick dexterity weapons, but it can be like a nice skill alternative, especially if you are using things like axes, which typically don't really have a good power sensing combo. But yeah, it's not going to be like the best skill in terms of damage or stance breaking, but it's still good in multiple different areas. As number 27, Stormcaller. Now, I've been referencing this skill like all throughout the video, because I've been comparing it to a lot of different other types of spinning-based skills, and when I do have these larger types of weapons, this is probably going to be the one that I use a lot of the playthrough, because it can stun lock all these smaller types of enemies when fighting knights or enemies like Millennia. This thing can just straight up trivialize them. Like, it is just an absolute stun locking tool, and it can just output a lot of damage, especially alongside the in-range Divine Beast Talisman, and it can proc status effects quickly too. It's just amazing. Now, when you're fighting enemies that cannot be staggered, I wouldn't really care for this one, because you get stuck in a longer animation, and in most cases, you're just not going to be able to win that trade. And in those instances, I'd rather have things like Spinning Strikes, because you can like cancel every single part of the attack, and it also doesn't get any hype armor as well. But there's like this more versatility, and it's probably better in those instances. So Stormcaller, although I do consider it to be like a staple that you can be able to use throughout most of your playthrough, there are just a lot of instances to where it's not going to be that useful of a skill to have. Number 26, Black Flame Tornado, which this is a flame art skill, so it's going to scale primarily off Faith, and it is just like an AoE attack that just serves as a boss melting machine. You don't even necessarily need to actually go into Faith to just get good damage. This thing can just melt them due to its black flame properties, as it does do percentage damage over time, and with how many times that it actually is hitting in quick succession over that like few second period that you do use the skill, a lot of bosses that give you these longer openings can just get destroyed. Now that is if you do get a longer opening against some bosses that just stagger you out of it. Obviously not going to be that useful of a skill. And unfortunately in the DLC, Black Flame and Destined Death has been nerfed to the point where it's like half as effective. Some bosses even like 3 times less effective. So I wouldn't really bother using it in the DLC. That's probably the main reason why I'm just going to not put it into the S tier, because even though it can just destroy a lot of bosses, it's probably just going to be for the base game now. Number 25, Blind Spots. This is a skill of the backhand blades, does result in an iframe dodge directly into a quick poking attack, which being able to just dodge and just directly attack right afterwards is most likely going to end up being a counter hit, because enemies are probably still in the middle of their attack combos, which means that you're going to get a whole bunch more damage with a skill like this, which might be like one of its downsides. Doesn't really output that much damage, but it is really cheap. It's easy to use. It can cheese a whole bunch of smaller enemies like knights and stuff like that, especially if they are using shields, because this thing can just completely bypass shields at that. Now, the things that stop me from putting it into the S tier is, one, its damage output is not going to be like the most amazing thing. It's not going to be that good of a skill to use against like larger types of bosses. It's practically useless there. And also does consume a lot of stamina. You can only really use this thing like 3 times back to back until you really just run out of stamina. So it's not something you can continuously spam like you can with other different types of skills, but it's still deserving of a high A tier. Anyway, getting into the S tier, this stuff is the best of the best, and it's probably the segment that people just end up skipping towards because nobody really cares to use anything less than broken, even though there's lots of really good and interesting stuff on the list. You guys just skip the entire video. I'm kidding, you guys are fine. Thanks for stopping by anyway, I appreciate it. But to get started, at number 24 in the S tier, we have the Poison Flower Blooms Twice, which this is a direct upgrade of the Poison Mothflight skill, in that when you actually use it against an enemy that's procced with poison, it removes the poison effect but does a flat percentage of damage in 5% damage, which the playstyle of proccing poison and using the skill to remove it and do damage is just like a worse version of bleed in my opinion. But thankfully, the Poison Flower Blooms Twice has a bit more going for it, because the skill itself is actually really good. It lunges really far, has incredibly quick recovery frames, it does piercing damage, and it also is the only Asher War in the entire game that can proc rot. Every single hit does roughly 140 rot buildup, so actually with a few hits, you can proc rot on most bosses in the game, which is really good. Now, one potential downside is that when you actually use the skill when the enemy is rotted, it also removes it as well, which you kind of don't want to remove rot, because rot is actually good, unlike poison, so it might be a downside. It would have been pretty cool if you had both poison and rot active. It would do like twice as much damage, but that doesn't really work that way. So that is a bit of a missed opportunity, but this skill can actually be infused on almost every single weapon type in the game. The most optimal pairing would be with like the Venomous Fang with an Occult Infusion, because you obviously want to pair this skill alongside a weapon that does proc poison really quickly, but you also want to have a lot of Arcane, because this skill does primarily scale off that stat. So Occult Infusions just to make sense, and an optimal Venomous Fang is with a Cragblade Infusion and just light attack spamming, but this skill does offer amazing utility because it can lunge in really far, can cheese a lot of different enemies like knights, gives you access to rot, gives you access to piercing damage, and also if enemies are just like one shot, you can just like lunge in towards them, just do that flat percentage of damage, and probably just end up killing them. Number 23, Flaming Strike, which is a fire-based skill, does scale off strength. Now that is just true for the projectile portion, because the follow-up swipe is just going to scale off AR, which most of the damage and most of the stance damage is going to come off that. The first part, you just kind of use it to like stun lock those smaller enemies, or just do a little bit of damage, a little bit of chip damage as well. Could be pretty nice in some cases. It's not going to go as far as things like Flame of the Red Mains, but the whole best part about it is that follow-up swipe that can lunge in really far, stagger enemies really nicely, and actually does buff the weapon with more fire damage for roughly 40 seconds, which is really good. Now, I don't think it's as good as things like Flame Spear, but you get Flame Spear all the way in the DLC, and that is going to scale off of the face stats as well. But the reason why I consider it to be better is because you can fully charge it, make it do more damage, and it can buff the weapon faster and actually give you a bit more damage as well. But this one is honestly just as good in my opinion. Number 22, Piercing Fang, which is one of the best poking attack skills in the game. This thing can just lunge in really far, be pretty quick, do some decent amount of stance damage. Like, it's just very easy to use, and lots of different types of weapons like thrusting swords, heavy thrusting swords, great spears. They could just be an amazing option. Now, I do think that Impaling Thrust is the better option because Impaling Thrust is a lot quicker, it's cheaper, and it does the exact same stance damage. Like, the speeds are faster, but it just does more stance damage, so it just makes more sense to me. But Piercing Fang does have its uses of being able to lunge further, obviously do a bit more damage. It also has better tracking. You can just like 180 with Piercing Fang, whereas Impaling Thrust doesn't really have that good at tracking, so maybe it's a bit easier to use something like this. But if you have a bit more experience in the game, maybe Impaling Thrust is a better option. Number 21, Braggart's Roar, which this is the last of the Roar-based weapon buffs that we are going to touch on, and I consider this one to be the best because it just gives you the best buff. It gives you a 10% damage boost, a 10% defense boost, and actually gives you like 10% more stamina recovery speed, while also just giving you that heavy attack change too, which the heavy attack change for the most part, I don't really care for much because it kind of makes the animations of heavy attacks be even longer, meaning that you're not going to stance break as fast as you would with just the regular heavy attack, but there can be some pairings, specifically the ones with the pole arms, that are going to be really good. Pairing it alongside a great spear or a halberd, you can just do like amazing damage, and when paired alongside things like the Raw Medallion, Highland Axe, the two-handed talisman, you're just doing monstrous amounts of damage, and it could be a decent power stance option too, because the effects are just going to stack. You're just going to have one in one hand and one in the other, and just be able to get a bunch more defenses and a bunch more stamina recovery speed. It's not going to give you as much as a damage boost as things like Cragblade, but those extra benefits might just be able to just make it the better option in some cases. Number 20, we have Barricade Shield, which this is like the best shield-based Asher Warrior in the game, and this thing just makes a lot of different enemies just a complete and utter joke. If you're having problems dodging enemies' movesets, just slap on any shield and slap on Barricade Shield Asher Warrior, and you're gonna be fine. You don't necessarily have to have a great shield just to be able to gain massive amounts of guard boost and just not be able to like just drain your entire stamina bar. Like, this Asher Warrior can very well just do that, and especially now with the recent patches, the medium shields have actually gotten a pretty decent buff in terms of guard boost, and Barricade Shield can just make that be a doubled effect, and you're just not going to take much damage at all. You're going to take a lot less stamina damage and just have a bunch more hardness on top of that, so enemies' attacks can just deflect off a lot more than they normally would. And best of all yet, this skill is very cheap, it's a fast animation, and it lasts for 10 seconds too. Like, this thing is amazing. Number 19, Spinning Strikes. Now, as I mentioned with Stormcaller, when you're fighting enemies that can be staggered, that one's probably the better option, but the enemies that cannot be staggered, I'd rather use Spinning Strikes because you don't get stuck and that's longer animation. Now, this is just a polearm type of skill, so if you are using things like a Great Hammer or a Great Axe, you probably have to go in a different direction. Probably Wild Strikes is going to be that direction. Now, the reason why I still value Spinning Strikes a whole bunch is because you can output a lot of DPS, and it also can be cancelled after every single swing. It pairs very well with status effects, so something like a Blood Flame Blade Grave Scythe can actually make for an amazing pairing, and you actually do get follow-up inputs as well that actually can stagger enemies pretty well and do a decent amount of stance damage. The major downside of this skill is that you don't really get any hyper armor, but if you do find your openings and use this skill, it can be extremely deadly. Number 18, Palm Blast. Now, this skill I consider to be the best for the hand-to-hand arts, and I think it just complements them perfectly because the moveset typically just a bunch of like quick attacks. You don't really get much stance damage. You're not going to get any hyper armor, but Palm Blast definitely does fill this niche for the weapon movesets, as you're not going to be able to get staggered out of the attack at all, especially when fully charged, and you're just going to be able to trade out, do amazing damage, really high stance damage. Now, you do get stuck in that longer animation if you do commit to that fully charging attack, and that's probably not going to be the best against a lot of different types of bosses. Also, the uncharged version is basically useless as well, but in those instances, you can just use the moveset, so that's why I do consider it to be like a good complement. But the skill can very well just chase a lot of different enemies. It can send all smaller enemies to the ground. The AoE actually does extend relatively fast, like some like medium range projectile attack, and it's going to do amazing stance damage. Number 17, Prayerful Strike, which is definitely one of the more underrated Ashes of War in the entire game. It can be a skill that you equip with like hammers or like larger types of weapons, and upon hitting an enemy, you're getting 30% of your health back. And this doesn't necessarily do any particular type of damage. It is like a sacred-based skill, so you are limited as to what infusion, but you could pair it alongside a heavy infusion and just do just straight up raw physical damage. And also with larger types of weapons, it could do over 35 stance damage as well. You get amazing hyper armor. Like any single time that you just need a bunch of health, you could just use a skill like this one. You could just have it sitting in your back pocket, maybe for power stancing. It could be your offhand option. You could just very well just leave it as your primary option too, and just trade out with every single boss. Like, it is just that good. Number 16, Royal Knight's Resolve, which is one of the best weapon buffs in the game. This thing gives you an 80% damage boost to all of your weapons. Now, the effect does wear off upon hitting an enemy once, but you only need to hit an enemy once for most different types of builds that pertain to just large, heavy weapons. So things like charged heavy attack builds, guard countering builds, potentially jumping attack builds. This might be one of the best weapon buffs to use, and against a lot of different types of enemies and bosses, they can just be destroyed. Now, for the most part, with these types of builds, you're probably going to go spec into more stance-breaking type of things, and I think Cragblade is just going to be the better option, because Cragblade does only boost your damage by 15%, but it lasts 60 seconds. You don't have to keep reapplying it over and over again, so it's a lot more efficient, and it also boosts your stance damage by 10%. So with these types of builds, I think this one is just the better option, but Royal Knight's Resolve obviously can just do more damage, and it also boosts all of your damage types, whereas Cragblade only boosts physical damage. So it does have its uses, despite me still thinking it's a bit outclassed, and it still is deserving of an S tier. Number 15, Wild Strikes, which is definitely one of the best hard-hitting skills in the entire game. I recommend pairing this one alongside some larger types of weapons because you can do that. You can throw it on things like great hammers and great axes and just end up doing amazing damage. Every single swing is only 2 FP. You get a lot of hype armor in it. You're going to trade out with a lot of different bosses. If you have like some status effect builds, it could pair nicely as well. A good pairing would be like with the Rusted Anchor because every single swing is going to do piercing damage, and with that really good hype armor, a lot of attacks might end up resulting in a counter attack, and you can just output amazing damage, and you also just get the option of a follow-up attack with a light and heavy can result in a high stance damaging attack. Also doesn't really consume much FP as well. Like the entire combo is just really good, and I consider this skill to just be one of the best ones. It's probably not going to be like the easiest thing to use in most cases, and then sometimes if you just don't have a long opening, I probably wouldn't really bother using it many times, but it still is deserving of an S tier. And it's number 14, Flame Spear, which I consider this one to be the slight bit upgraded version of Flaming Strike, and that it does work as like a fire-based attack that can buff your weapon. Now, Flame Spear can actually be equipped on things like Colossal Swords, which is going to be one of the main reasons why I do value it a lot, and it is going to be a poking attack that can be fully charged. It can actually go really far distances and actually just do amazing damage at that as well. And the fact that it can be buffed with only just one little small poking attack means that the animation is not that long for it to actually be buffed. So when you are making a faith-based build with an infused weapon, you kind of go back and forth between Flame Art and Sacred, and every single time that they're going to go the Flame Art infusion, I'm more likely than not going to be using Flame Spear. Number 13, Carrion Sovereignty. Now, as I mentioned with things like Carrion Grandeur and Carrion Greatsword, this one is just going to be like the beefed up version of those skills because it can just be charged a couple times and just end up doing way more damage, way more stance damage, and just give you the option of a follow-up attack, which this follow-up attack can come out really fast, and for some reason this also just comes fully charged as well, and the entire combo can do like 93 stance damage, which is just absurd. It does take a little bit to be able to charge up, so against a lot of different bosses, maybe in the DLC, not going to be the best thing to use. You could also just pair it alongside things like the Stone Barbed tier, and it's inevitably do over 120 stance damage with the entire combo, which can like probably stance break a lot of bosses just in regular new game. Now, one downside is obviously going to be its long animation, and it doesn't really get any hype armor unless you do pair it alongside larger types of weapons like great swords or great katanas, curved great swords, things like that. You can get a nice amount of hype armor, but against bosses that is going to hit you really hard, that doesn't really make much of a difference. So there's certain circumstances where it's not going to be like the best thing to use, but I still consider it to be one of the best skills in the entire game. Number 12, we have Giant Hunt, which this is a poking attack type of skill, so therefore it has to compete with things like Impaling Thrust and Piercing Fang, and for the most part, I probably don't value them as much because those skills can lunge further, have a faster animation, and do just as much stance damage, but Giant Hunt can be infused onto a Colossal Sword where the other skills cannot be, and with this Colossal Sword build, it might make for one of the best pairings. Honestly, Giant Hunt might be better than Lion's Claw in some cases too. It can do more damage, it's going to do the better damage type, it can send enemies flying into the air, it's going to do just as much damage as Lion's Claw 2 in that faster animation, but Lion's Claw obviously does get a lot more hype armor, it lunges further, it still flattens enemies to the ground, it's going to be a much easier to use, but that little bit of skill gap difference, you might just want to use things like Giant Hunt instead, because it probably just has a higher skill ceiling in my opinion, so it is really good, one of the best in the game, but in terms of ease of use, it's probably not going to beat out things like Lion's Claw. Number 11, Blood Tax. Now, as I was mentioning with Repeating Thrust, this is basically the identical animation, does that like 4-hitting poking attack with that little pirouette swing. It can stun lock so many different types of smaller enemies, infinite stun lock paired alongside status effect builds. It's just going to be broken. The fact that you can pair it alongside things like the Great Katana or the Sword Lance is honestly just busted. Like it can do this ridiculous amounts of damage with a build like this. Now, Repeating Thrust does actually do more damage than Blood Tax, but Blood Tax actually does give you the ability to get a whole bunch of health regen. And the entire combo can very well heal almost 20% of your entire health bar in just a short amount of time, and also just give you a whole bunch of like status effect build up too. Like, it's just genuinely really good. And it's to the point that I just want to use blood tax almost every single time, despite it getting less damage. But it also actually does receive a boost with the Arnspark set, which actually can boost it by roughly 12% more damage. And with this entire set equipped, it can roughly do almost just as much damage as repeating thrust. So one of the only downsides that blood tax might have against repeating thrust is probably just counteracted anyway. Number 10, Impaling Thrust. Now this skill I consider to be the best poking attack skill in the entire game. It's incredibly quick, really cheap, does amazing stance damage. In fact, just as much stance damage as things like a piercing fang weapon would do. You can put it on so many different weapon types like great swords, great spears, thrusting swords, heavy thrusting swords. There's so many different options that you can put it on, and it just makes every single one just an amazing pairing because it can just do really good damage in a really short amount of time, and a lot of different enemies are just going to be just cheesed by it. Number 9, Bloodblade, to what I consider the best blade skill in the entire game, is an arcane-based projectile attack, very similar to something like the Reduvier is, but I consider this one to be the better version because you just can get more damage due to be able to pair it alongside larger types of weapons, things like curved swords or katanas, and it actually does have a hitbox at closer ranges, so you're just doing so much more bleed build-up, so much more damage. Now you do have like the effect of just taking a little bit of health, but it's only on the first initial cast, so with consecutive spamming, you're not going to lose any type of health whatsoever, and it's also going to consume like half the amount of FP compared to Reduvier, consume a lot less stamina, and is potentially just do more stance damage too. Now it's probably not going to be useful against enemies that cannot bleed out, but against enemies that can be susceptible to bleed, this is going to be one of the best skills to use. If you have like an occult infused like Nagakiba or Scavenger's Curve Sword, just slap on things like Bloodblade and every single one of those enemies are dying. Number 8, we have Square Off, and at number 7, we have Unsheath. I might as well talk about both of these skills at the exact same time because they're both stance-based skills that are just specific to their own weapon types, Square Off being for the straight sword and Unsheath being for the katana. And the reason why both of these are amazing is because they're incredibly cheap, really quick, and just output ridiculous amounts of stance damage. Like the Square Off skill can get you 40 stance damage with that heavy attack, which might be like a slight longer animation, but it is like a nice lunge, does do piercing damage, and 40 stance damage is like more so than like a Colossal Sword charged heavy attack. Like that is just absurd amounts of stance damage that you get with just a straight sword. Like that just takes the only downside that these smaller types of weapons have and just like flips them on their head. And this is very true with Unsheath as well. This heavy attack, which comes out in almost an instant, does 30 stance damage. And you can like basically cancel the recovery animations with like a crouch or a roll and just continuously spam it over and over again, which is probably the main reason why I prefer Unsheath over Square Off is because katanas typically just have more range. They're going to get access to bleed, and you're just going to be able to spam it over and over again very quickly. But Square Off also does have that light attack version, which also does 30 stance damage, and also can be a very quick animation. So like it doesn't really matter which one you use. I just think that if you're going to have a katana or a straight sword, these are just going to be the options that I pair alongside with them. Number 6, Ice Spear, which is one of the best magic projectiles in the entire game. It is a cold-based skill, therefore it can scale with both dexterity and intelligence. Now, when you do have an intelligence build, you're already going to have access to like frost-based spells and some magic-based spells anyway. So I think this is going to pair best alongside that dexterity type of build, and being able to have magic damage with a dexterity build that can proc frost very quickly can be very beneficial. Also, this could leave it with like a cold infusion, and at maximum levels, being that you can get scalings in both dex and intelligence, it probably can maximize the damage that way as well. But the reason why Ice Spear is just amazing is because it's really cheap, it's a quick cast, and it does ridiculous amounts of damage. Like it's really good damage, good stance damage. It procs frost faster than almost any other projectile in the game. Like it's just incredible. Number 5, Golden Vow, to what I consider probably the most useful Asher War in the entire game. Now, most of my Asher War ranking lists in the past have put Golden Vow at number 1, but for the sake of just having more fun with this list this time, I'm just going to slap it in number 5, even though I just use Golden Vow Asher War with almost every single build, except for a Faith build, which is like the only instance to where I wouldn't use this, because with a Faith build, you're really going to have access to the spell-based version, which that version is just a direct upgrade, but the Golden Vow Asher War, you just use it for every other different type of build, strength, dexterity, intelligence, arcane, just slap Golden Vow onto a dagger. You get it right at the beginning of the game. Before every single boss fight, just use the skill, and for the next 45 seconds, you just get a bunch of damage, and you get a bunch of defenses, and it's going to be an aura buff too. Therefore, you can buff your allies. It's going to stack with your body buffs, going to stack with your healing spells. It's just amazing. At number 4, we have Stormblade, which is a quality-based projectile attack, does scale with either strength or dexterity, does scale a bit better off dexterity, but the fact that it is quality means that it's very versatile. Doesn't matter what type of infusion that you have it alongside with, it's going to do amazing damage. Now, the reasons why it's so good is because it can stagger really well, you can spam it over and over again, and with consecutive casts, it's actually pretty cheap, only like 6 or 7 FP with every single cast. It also does get a hitbox at closer ranges, so if you're using like large weapons like a great katana or a curved greatsword, you're doing amazing damage. It could also just proc those status effects quickly at these closer ranges. And as of the DLC, it can be boosted by things like the Enraged Divine Beast Talisman and the Divine Beast Helmet. You can just get amazing damage with a build like this. And as I always mention, projectile attacks just cheese the entire game. It doesn't matter what point of the game that you're in, they're just always going to be amazing because it means you don't have to engage with enemies. If enemies like to move or dodge around or be high up in the air, it's just going to be a direct counter to them as well, and it doesn't really get much better than Stormblade. Number 3, we have Wing Stance, to what I consider the best of all the stance-based Ashes of War, this one infusible onto the Milady, and the reason why I consider it to be broken and the best one is because both of its stance-based skills are just insane. It has the flurry attack, which you can spam over and over again. It can stun lock all these smaller types of enemies, all these knights and omens, which otherwise, like your regular moveset of the light greatsword, cannot really do that. And it also gets the option of that poking attack, which is poking attack, does like 30 stance damage. It lunges in really far. It's like having like spinning slash and like piercing fang infused into one weapon. And you can also just get more damage, and you can combo them directly back and forth. Like you can just go with the flurry attack skill and then go directly into the poking attack. And also, there is the existence of the Rolana's cameo, which I didn't really mention with Unsheath and Square Off, which typically with those skills, I don't really care to use them alongside that talisman as much. I'll still always have it equipped, but you just always want to keep spamming with those skills over and over again. But you actually benefit a lot more with the Rolana's cameo with the Wing Stance than you otherwise would with the other different types of skills. And the main reason being is because when you have it fully charged, and you use like the light attack version and you keep spamming the flurry attack, it's actually not going to remove the buff at all. Because normally with the talisman, once you use the skill once, it removes the buff completely, but you can just keep spamming it over and over, and it's not going to end until you end the combo, or you just actually get hit or staggered out of it. So yeah, this skill literally gets everything that you need. It can lunge really far, it can stun lock, amazing stance damage for barely any FP and stamina cost. Number 2, Crackblade, which is probably the best weapon buff in the entire game. I glaze this like every single day. It's just amazing. It's a weapon buff that actually gives you 15% more physical damage and 10% more stance damage for 60 seconds. So any single time that you're going to go with like a charged heavy attack build, a jumping attack build, just light attack spam, guard counterings, I think Crackblade is like the option. And these builds have just only gotten better over time due to things like the two-handed talisman, the deflecting tier. Like you can make broken builds with every single one of these types, and Crackblade is just at the center of it. You can just get way more stance damage and just way more damage to all of your builds. Now it might not be the most versatile thing because it only does boost physical damage. So when you are going to go with like these elemental types of builds, I probably wouldn't use Crackblade, and I might use things like Royal Knight Resolve instead. But that one you have to keep buffing it over and over again. And I just like the convenience of Crackblade. Just use the buff one time, you have it for 60 seconds, and you're just going to benefit of more damage and more stance damage. And at number 1, I'm sure to nobody's surprise, we have Lion's Claw, the single most brain-dead skill in the entire game, probably outside of like Taker's Flame of the Blasphemous Blade. This thing just requires 0 skill at all. You can put it onto like basically any single weapon, just click the button over and over again, and it does not matter. Everything is just going to die. You do this really quick front flipping attack that is basically impossible to get staggered out of. Infinite hype armor, amazing stance damage. It flattens smaller enemies to the ground so you can just keep stun locking them over and over again. You get pretty good hitboxes. It lunges pretty far. Doesn't really consume that much FP as well. Like it is just ridiculous. It's probably not going to be like the most optimal option in terms of like DPS or like being able to stance break as fast, but it doesn't really get much better in terms of ease of use than it does with Lion's Claw. It's over. It's finally done. Oh my god, I never want to do that again until like next week when I actually rank all of the incantations, which is like over 120 or 130 incantations in the entire game, which is literally more than the Ashes of War. So even though I said I'm not going to do it, we're going to do it again, and then we're going to do it again for the sorcerers again later after that until I end up hating my life. Actually, probably in between those videos, I might make like a ranking of talismans or ranking of crystal tiers. Might do something like that, just a bit smaller, so I don't actually end up just burning myself out. But yeah, definitely do subscribe for that one, and also follow me on Twitch because I'm live there basically every single day doing a bunch of challenge runs or testing things out to make stupid videos like this one. So please give me some support there and give me some love in this one because yeah, this one took a while and took a lot out of me. So I'll appreciate anything that you guys can give, whether it's a comment or a like. So definitely do that. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.